our Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy joins us now. Good to see you this morning. Can I ask you, first of all, what your understanding is of what's currently on the table this morning? So we heard the various figures back and forward yesterday, didn't we? We understood that Andy Burnham was happy to accept 65, coming down from higher figures he'd wanted previously in terms of support for the people of Greater Manchester. We then heard that the 22 million figure, which I think is for enforcement and test and trace, is on the table. But there's a question mark about whether this 60 that the government had offered is still in play. What, after all of this, have the people of Greater Manchester got?
I think what we've got is a government that is now actively doing harm to its own citizens. I was on a call with Matt Hancock at 4:30 yesterday afternoon, where he was telling Greater Manchester MPs that the only thing that is now on offer to Greater Manchester to help us survive this winter is £22 million. We were told by the Prime Minister's advisor that there had been £55 million on the table, but that was now no longer on offer. At the same time, the Mayor of Greater Manchester was learning about that offer via a text message in front of the media at a press conference. And later, Matt Hancock came to the House of Commons chamber, said that they had offered 60 million and that was still on the table. It is really hard to describe how chaotic this process has been over the last 10 days, but the upshot of it is that we're going into tier 3 restrictions after months and months of being in tier 2 restrictions, people unable to see family, businesses struggling to operate without any help from the government. It's just, we're just in complete shock, to be honest, that
I mean, we could see, and we're out of it, anybody watching any news yesterday could see how the confusion was unfolding. But you say the government's waging war on the north. They might see it, that the war is being waged by Andy Burnham, by the Tory MPs, by the people of that area on it, because they are the ones that are having to make these decisions. You've resisted it. They say they've negotiated for 10 days. Is the war being started entirely by the government?
Look, we were one of the first areas of the country in Greater Manchester to accept restrictions way back at the end of July. My own constituency in Wigan had 9.6 cases per 100,000 at that point. There are not many areas in the country that have such low rates as that now. And we accepted those restrictions because we were told by the government's scientific advisors that we needed to get a grip on the virus. We've been living with them for months. We've been negotiating with the government in good faith. But over the last week, my council leader told me last night he's had 2 conversations with the government. At one meeting, they were told, here is the financial package on offer, take it or leave it, you've got 10 minutes to decide. The government has not been discussing this with us.
What was that amount, Lisa? Because I think what people probably do need to understand is why it is that Greater Manchester feels it needs to have more per person during this, and rightly so in many ways, I'm sure, but why it needs to have more per person than Liverpool and Lancashire, who are also in tier 3, because to be equal, it would have been £56 million there or thereabouts for Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham, we understand, wanted 65. So why is it that Greater Manchester needed or deserved £10 million more?
Million, didn't he?
The end point that Andy Burnham came to was 65 million, take it or leave it. They left it. But why is it 65 million for Andy Burnham and 56 million for neighbouring counties? Just explain why. Why does Greater Manchester deserve more, and why we're in this chaos today?
Sure. I mean, first of all, we didn't leave it. The door is absolutely still open. We've been told by the government that this is it, that they're now not going to provide any support at all. But if they are willing to talk to us, we're still here.
But the reason it broke down yesterday, obviously, is because Andy Burnham wanted 65. He wasn't given 65. And so it's obviously, for whatever reason, the government have thrown their toys out the pram and it's now 22 and who knows what will happen today. The point I'm asking is I just want to know why Andy Burnham is asking for 65 when the neighbouring counties accepted 56.
Because we think that 65 is the absolute basic minimum that we can have to help our businesses and our people survive over the winter. The reason why Greater Manchester
point is why do you need more than those other people? Okay, sorry.
The reason that different position from other from other parts of the country is because we've been in lockdown here since the end of July. So we've got businesses that are racking up significant amounts of debt because they've been operating under the sort of restrictions that have literally just come into force in London for several months, which mean they've had huge amounts of cost, no financial support from the government, but they've had to keep operating.
So you're saying you're starting from a much lower base than Liverpool or Lancashire, and therefore you need that extra 10 million to make up for that deficit in order to level up, essentially. That's what you're arguing?
We've also got minimum wage workers who've racked up huge amounts of debt because they've been operating on lower wages. They've taken cuts to hours because of these restrictions that we've been living with for months now. And genuinely, what will happen if we don't get financial support from the government is that people will start to be evicted from their homes. The government hasn't paused evictions as they did when the national lockdown happened. We're going to have people sleeping on the streets in winter, in the middle of a pandemic. I told the Health Secretary that last night. He didn't deny it. The government knows how serious this situation is. And I would just say to you as well that in Liverpool and Lancashire, many of my constituents cross over to Merseyside and Lancashire for work every single day. The leaders there, who I'm in touch with daily, didn't ask for that amount of money. They asked for far more money and they were shut down completely.
So you're going to have to accept the 56 million, presumably, now. If Matt Hancock's right and that's still on the table, the door's open, that's all we can give you. It's got to be equal to Liverpool and Lancashire. You'll take the 56 million. I mean, what damage do you think this has done to people's trust in the north in this whole process? I mean, everybody's trust has been damaged, I think, to some extent, we can all agree, by the test and trace chaos. Lots of different things have happened to lots of different people. But this particular last 24 hours, what is your sense of what it's done to people's trust?
I mean, it's been the last 10 days, to be honest. There now is a genuine sense across Greater Manchester and I think across the north of England that the government has no clear strategy. It doesn't have our interests at heart. I think people are genuinely in a state of disbelief, and I haven't felt levels of anger like this since I was...
Are the Tory MPs as angry as you are, though? I mean, that's the interesting thing now, isn't it? Whether the Tory MPs who are on Andy Burnham's side throughout appear to be changing their mind now, saying, listen, let's just leave it where it is, let's accept what we can take. There's this vote today. What do you think your fellow Tory northern MPs are going to do today? Will they go with what their constituents and the anger there and vote for this national package of Tier 3 extra funding, or will they actually go with the government?
I think you're probably likely to see the northern Tories split in both directions. I think there are some that are clearly very, very angry on behalf of their constituents. They've voiced that anger on private calls with health ministers that I've been on over the last few weeks, and I think some of them will choose their constituents. I'm sorry to say that I think there are others who will choose to side with the government over the people that they were elected to represent, and I would just urge them, even at this late hour, we've got a few hours to go until that vote, please stand with us and with the north of England. We need your help in order to survive this, and people will not forgive anybody who doesn't stand up for them at this really critical moment.
Lisa, you know I've got family that live in that area. You know I've got friends that live in that area. I know how hard it's been for people there very directly, and I know how difficult it's been in very unusual circumstances for them there. But I also know people in other parts of the country that are facing the things that you listed, racking up debt, you know, long time with restrictions. You say it's, for instance, in London, it's only been a couple of weeks. There are people in London who are on minimum wage with no work during lockdown as well. You know, these things are built up across the country. And for people in Cornwall and people in other parts of the UK who haven't got those infection rates, they're going to be thinking, well, hang on a minute, you know, if we don't get this under control, and there are accusations that some people didn't behave and keep to the restrictions in Tier 2, which is what's led to Tier 3 as well, which adds into the mix of anger. They'll be looking at this situation and think, well, hang on a minute, you know, we're not getting this support. And if we don't stick to it, we're going to have a national lockdown. We're going to have a circuit breaker. And people who are not facing the same health risk are going to have the same economic harm. So what do you think of that circuit breaker and of that big push to deal with it, and of Labour's position on that?
Well, look, we went into lockdown in Wigan at the end of July, when our cases were just 9.6 per 100,000. There aren't many places in the country now that have such low levels as that. The truth is that although there are higher rates in some parts of the country, like Greater Manchester, the embers are burning everywhere. And the government's own scientific advisors say, unless we get a grip on this now, we'll all be paying the price for a very long time to come. I genuinely believe that all of those areas need financial support in order to get through it. London is now in tier 2 restrictions, and my heart goes out to people who are now having to deal with the same restrictions on friends and family, on businesses, as we've been dealing with here for several months. But that's why we need a short but deep circuit breaker so that we can get control of the virus and start to fix, test, trace and isolate. Unless we do that, none of us will be in a good situation. But the way the government's behaved over the last few days...
Well,
honestly,
you say that, but the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tan, disagrees and says there isn't a need for that circuit breaker. There's a need for localised, strict lockdowns appropriate to the figures in those areas and not for a national.
The heat maps were really...
And the heat maps are concentrated
obvious in a way to show
I mean,
where the problems are.
That's the problem, isn't there? There are going to be... there are people that think that there is... maybe even, Lisa, on an unconscious level, a political play here. You saw Andy Burnham, like the king of the north yesterday, taking on government with huge emotional support from the people around him for very good reasons, and I'm sure his reasons are genuine too. It feels like a big political play, which I think is muddying the waters. I know that there are Tory MPs supporting it too, but it looks like, the Labour Northern Heartlands rising up and trying to stand against the government and getting a lot of airtime for it and support.
We have 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester, one of which is run by the Conservatives, and every single one of them has stood together over this time to say to the government, if you don't provide adequate financial support, our economy is going to collapse, people's livelihoods are going to go, we're just not going to survive this. And we all the way through this, we've been desperate to get a deal with the government.
People say that about a circuit breaker as well. They say we can't survive it in other parts of the country. This is the problem, isn't it? With these decisions, there's no risk-free path. There is no path where it looks rosy for anyone.
The government's scientific advisors have been clear, actually. The SAGE advisors published a document which the government withheld from us for several weeks, saying that unless we had a short but deep circuit breaker, we weren't going to get control of the virus. Bolton in Greater Manchester, whose council is run by the Conservatives, has had restrictions, closed pubs for several months, the sort of tier 3 restrictions that the government is now imposing on us, but the virus has continued to ride. It's really clear that what the government is doing is just not working. And so we're asking them for a short period of time to put in place a national circuit breaker to get control of the virus. It'll be in all of our interests to do that.